Whispers of war, an evacuation begins. The morning mist clung to the railway platform like a reluctant farewell, and in that grey September dawn of 1939, 8-year-old Lily Hartwell stood clutching a brown paper parcel that contained everything she was permitted to bring from her old life. The label pinned to her navy wool coat bore her name in her mother's careful script, but already it felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had lived in a different world just 24 hours ago. The evacuation had been planned with the methodical precision that would soon characterize Britain's entire war effort. Operation Pied Piper, as the government called it, represented the largest movement of civilian population in British history. Nearly 2 million children, pregnant women, and disabled individuals would be relocated from major cities and industrial centers to the presumed safety of rural areas. The logistics alone were staggering. Hundreds of special trains, thousands of volunteer helpers, and a registration system that attempted to track every evacuee across the country. But for Lily, standing on Platform 7 at Paddington Station, these grand strategic considerations meant nothing. What mattered was the way her mother's gloved hand trembled as she smoothed down Lily's dark hair one final time, and how the familiar scent of her mother's lavender powder seemed to fade even as she breathed it in. "Remember what we practiced, darling," her mother whispered, kneeling to adjust Lily's gas mask case. The small cardboard box hung from a string around her neck, bumping against her chest with each movement. "You're to be polite and helpful, mind your manners. And write to me every Sunday after church." Around them, the platform churned with controlled chaos. Hundreds of children, ages 5 to 16, waited in loosely organized groups while volunteer workers checked names against endless lists. The Women's Voluntary Service had mobilized with remarkable efficiency, their green uniforms a constant presence as they guided families through the process. Teachers from various London schools attempted to maintain some semblance of order among their charges, though many of the younger children had already begun to cry. The decision to evacuate had not come suddenly. Throughout the summer of 1939, as diplomatic tensions escalated across Europe, British authorities had refined their civil defense preparations. The memory of the Great War's Zeppelin raids remained fresh, but intelligence reports suggested that any future conflict would bring aerial bombardment on an unprecedented scale. The Luftwaffe's capabilities, demonstrated during the Spanish Civil War, indicated that civilian populations would face direct attack from the first days of hostilities. Lily's father worked at the Woolwich Arsenal, one of London's primary munitions facilities. Her mother took in piecework sewing for a factory that would soon convert to parachute production. Their modest terrace house sat directly beneath what military planners had identified as a likely bombing approach to the London docks. The family's evacuation notice had arrived with mathematical inevitability. "All aboard for the Countryside Express," called a cheerful volunteer, though her brightness seemed forced against the morning's solemnity. "Adventure awaits, children." The train itself was nothing special, a collection of standard passenger carriages pressed into extraordinary service. But as Lily climbed the narrow steps and found herself squeezed into a compartment with 7 other children, she realized she was participating in something historic. Not that she understood it in those terms, of course. At 8 years old, history was something that happened to other people in books. Her compartment companions represented a cross-section of London's working families. There was Tommy Brennan, whose father drove a delivery lorry for Harrods. Margaret Sinclair came from a family of dockers in the East End. The eldest among them, 14-year-old James Crawford, wore the uniform of a grammar school scholarship boy and carried himself with the careful dignity of someone determined to prove his worthiness. As the train pulled away from Paddington, gathering speed through London's increasingly sparse suburbs, Lily pressed her face to the window and watched her world disappear. The familiar landmarks of her neighborhood, the corner shop where she bought penny sweets, the park where she fed ducks with stale bread, the church where her grandmother was buried, all of it fell away behind clouds of steam and smoke. The journey west took nearly 4 hours, with frequent stops at smaller stations where local volunteers boarded to check on the children's welfare. At Reading, kind ladies from the Red Cross distributed sandwiches and bottles of milk. At Swindon, a group of girl guides led the carriages in singing "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," though most of the younger children didn't know the words. Lily found herself studying the landscape beyond the windows with intense concentration. She had never been outside London before, and the rolling hills of the Cotswolds seemed impossibly green and spacious. Sheep dotted distant fields like scattered cotton balls, and ancient stone walls divided the countryside into a patchwork of agricultural purpose. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was also profoundly foreign to a child whose entire experience had been shaped by narrow streets and terraced houses. The billeting process had been organized with typical British attention to bureaucratic detail. Rural communities had been surveyed months in advance, with local authorities identifying suitable accommodation for evacuees. Families with spare rooms were strongly encouraged to volunteer, though some required more persuasion than others. The government payment of 10 shillings and sixpence per child helped overcome financial objections, but cultural differences between urban evacuees and rural hosts would prove more challenging to navigate. Their destination was the village of Little Wickham, population approximately 800 souls, nestled in a valley where the river Windrush meandered through water meadows and ancient oak groves. The village had remained largely unchanged for centuries, a cluster of honey-coloured limestone cottages surrounding a Norman church, with a single main street that connected the railway halt to the market square. When the train finally wheezed to a stop at Little Wickham's modest platform, Lily felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Through the carriage window, she could see a small crowd of adults waiting with expressions that ranged from welcoming to resigned. These were the people who would determine her fate for, well, nobody seemed quite certain how long this arrangement was supposed to last. "Right then, children," announced Mrs. Patterson, their escort from the London County Council. "Remember your best behaviour. These kind people have opened their homes to you during Britain's hour of need. You represent not just yourselves, but your families and your city." The platform scene that followed would be repeated in hundreds of villages across Britain that autumn. Children stood in uncertain lines while potential hosts walked among them, making selections based on criteria both practical and mysterious. Some families clearly preferred older children who could help with farm work or household duties. Others gravitated toward the youngest evacuees, perhaps responding to maternal instincts or simply finding small children less threatening to their established routines. Lily watched with growing anxiety as her compartment companions were chosen one by one. Tommy Brennan went to a farmer who needed help with his harvest. Margaret Sinclair was selected by the village postmistress, who declared that she could use assistance with sorting mail. Even shy little Peter Walsh, who had cried for most of the journey, found himself claimed by an elderly couple who reminded him of his grandparents. As the platform gradually emptied, Lily began to worry that she had somehow been forgotten or overlooked. Her brown paper parcel felt heavier with each passing minute, and the label on her coat seemed to flutter more urgently in the afternoon breeze. She tried to remember her mother's instructions about standing up straight and smiling politely, but her face felt frozen with uncertainty. Then she heard a gentle voice say, "You must be Lily Hartwell." She turned to see a woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in a practical tweed skirt and cream-coloured blouse. Her brown hair was pinned back in a sensible style, and her hands showed the evidence of someone accustomed to useful work. But her eyes were kind, and when she smiled, Lily felt the first small flutter of hope since leaving London. "I'm Miss Eleanor Whitmore," the woman continued, extending her hand in a gesture that treated Lily as a proper person rather than simply a displaced child. "I teach at the village school, and I've prepared a room for you in my cottage. I do hope you'll find it comfortable." As they walked together down the village's main street, past the ancient church and the Tudor-era inn, Lily realized that her great adventure, or exile depending on one's perspective, was about to begin in earnest. Behind them, the train prepared for its return journey to London, carrying with it the last tangible connection to her former life. The war that would reshape the world was only days old, and already it was transforming the lives of ordinary people in ways both profound and intimate. In the coming months, Lily would discover that displacement could become a different kind of home, and that strangers could evolve into family through the simple alchemy of shared experience and mutual care. But for now, she simply walked beside Miss Whitmore through the golden afternoon light, carrying her brown paper parcel and trying to imagine what tomorrow might bring. Blackout and rationing, a new normal. The morning light that filtered through Miss Whitmore's cottage windows carried with it the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of church bells calling the village to Sunday service. Lily had slept fitfully in the narrow bed beneath the eaves, her dreams a confused tangle of London streets and endless green fields. When she woke, for a moment she couldn't remember where she was, until the unfamiliar silence reminded her that she was no longer home. Miss Whitmore had prepared a breakfast of porridge and weak tea, apologizing gently for the meager fare. "I'm afraid we must all learn to make do with less," she explained, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone already adapting to new realities. "The government has introduced rationing, you see. Each person receives a book of coupons that determines how much butter, sugar and meat we can purchase each week." Lily examined the small booklet Miss Whitmore showed her, its pages filled with tiny squares marked with mysterious numbers and letters. The concept seemed impossibly complex to her 8-year-old mind, yet she sensed the gravity in the way the adults discussed it. This wasn't simply about food. It was about fairness, about ensuring that everyone shared equally in the sacrifices that war demanded. After breakfast, Miss Whitmore walked Lily through the village to meet the Wilson family, where she would be staying permanently. The Wilsons lived in a stone cottage with a slate roof and a garden that stretched back toward the edge of the village common. Mrs. Wilson, a sturdy woman with graying hair pinned back in a practical bun, greeted them at the garden gate with soil-stained hands and a warm smile. "You must be our Lily," she said, wiping her palms on her apron before extending them in welcome. "I've been preparing the spare room for you, dear. It's not much, but it's warm and dry, and you'll have a proper view of the garden." Mr. Wilson emerged from behind the cottage, carrying a spade and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had spent his morning in productive labor. He was tall and lean, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked the land for decades. "Welcome to Little Wickham, young lady," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "I hope you won't mind getting your hands dirty. We've got important work to do." The important work, Lily soon discovered, was part of something called the Dig for Victory campaign. The government had launched this initiative to encourage every household to grow their own vegetables, transforming flower beds, lawns, and any available patch of earth into productive growing space. The Wilsons had converted nearly their entire back garden into neat rows of vegetables. Potatoes, carrots, cabbages, and runner beans climbing wooden poles that Mr. Wilson had constructed with military precision. "Every potato we grow ourselves," Mrs. Wilson explained as she led Lily through the transformed garden, "is one less that needs to be imported on ships that might be attacked by German submarines. It's our way of fighting back, you see, not with guns or bombs, but with determination and hard work." Lily found herself oddly comforted by this idea. In London, the war had felt like something that happened to them, something beyond their control. Here, in this small village garden, she could see how ordinary people were taking action, making choices that mattered. The neat rows of vegetables represented more than food. They were symbols of resistance, of the refusal to be defeated by circumstances. As evening approached, Mrs. Wilson introduced Lily to one of the most significant changes that war had brought to daily life: the blackout. Every window in every building throughout Britain had to be completely covered after sunset, preventing any light from escaping that might guide German bombers to their targets. "It's absolutely crucial," Mrs. Wilson explained as she showed Lily how to properly hang the heavy black curtains that would transform their cozy cottage into what felt like a sealed cave. "Even the tiniest sliver of light can be seen from an aircraft. The air raid precautions wardens patrol the streets every night, and if they spot so much as a candle's glow through a gap in the curtains, they'll knock on your door immediately." The process of preparing for blackout became an evening ritual that required the coordination of the entire household. First, they would draw all the regular curtains. Then came the special blackout curtains, made of thick, dark material that blocked every photon of light. Mrs. Wilson checked each window methodically, running her fingers along the edges to ensure no gaps remained. When the transformation was complete, the cottage felt utterly different. The familiar rooms became mysterious spaces filled with shadows and muffled sounds. Conversation seemed to take on a more intimate quality, as if the darkness had drawn the family closer together around their small circle of lamplight. "It takes getting used to," Mr. Wilson admitted, settling into his chair beside the wireless radio. "But you'd be surprised how quickly it becomes normal, and there are unexpected benefits." The silence, the sense of being safely enclosed. Sometimes I think we appreciate the warmth and light more now that we understand how precious they are. Lily discovered that he was right about the adjustment. Within a few days, the blackout routine had become as natural as brushing her teeth. She learned to navigate the cottage in near darkness, her hands finding familiar surfaces, her feet remembering the location of furniture and doorways. The world beyond the windows might as well have ceased to exist. There were no streetlights, no illuminated shop windows, no glow from neighboring houses. The rationing system, too, became part of the rhythm of daily life. Mrs. Wilson planned meals with the strategic precision of a military quartermaster, calculating how to make their weekly allowances stretch across 7 days while still providing adequate nutrition. 2 ounces of butter per person per week, 4 ounces of bacon, 8 ounces of sugar. The numbers became as familiar as prayers. But rather than creating hardship, Lily observed that rationing seemed to foster an unexpected sense of community solidarity. Neighbors shared recipes for making meals from limited ingredients. Mrs. Peterson next door had discovered how to make a satisfying cake using grated carrots and a tiny amount of precious sugar. Mrs. Williams from the cottage across the lane had perfected a technique for making a small amount of bacon flavor an entire pot of vegetable soup. "We're all in this together," Mrs. Wilson would say as she carefully measured out their daily tea ration. "No one has more than anyone else, and no one has to go without." There's something rather comforting about that, don't you think? Lily did find it comforting, though she couldn't have articulated why. Perhaps it was the knowledge that every family in Britain was sitting down to similar meals, facing identical challenges, making the same small sacrifices. The rationing system created a form of equality that transcended social class and economic status. The wealthy couldn't simply buy their way to abundance, and the poor weren't left to struggle alone. The ration books themselves became objects of almost sacred importance. Mrs. Wilson kept theirs in a special drawer in the kitchen dresser, handling them with the care one might reserve for important legal documents. Each trip to the village shops required careful planning: which coupons to use, which items to purchase, how to balance immediate needs against future requirements. Mr. Henderson, who ran the village grocery, had adapted his shop to accommodate the new system with remarkable efficiency. Behind his counter, he maintained detailed records of every customer's purchases, ensuring that no one exceeded their allowances while helping families make the most of their rations. His recommendations carried the weight of expertise. He knew which tinned goods offered the best nutritional value, which vegetables would keep longest, how to substitute unavailable ingredients in traditional recipes. As autumn deepened into winter, Lily began to understand that this new way of living wasn't temporary inconvenience, but fundamental transformation. The blackout, the rationing, the victory gardens, these weren't simply wartime measures, but the building blocks of a different kind of society. People were learning to depend on each other in ways that peacetime had never required. Evening gatherings in the Wilson cottage took on a special quality during those long, dark months. With the wireless providing their only connection to the larger world beyond Little Wickham, the family would sit together in their circle of lamplight, sharing stories, playing simple games, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of people who had learned to find contentment in small pleasures. Mrs. Wilson would often work on her knitting during these evening hours, her needles clicking rhythmically as she created warm scarves and mittens for the local Soldiers' Comfort Fund. The soft sound became associated in Lily's mind with safety and security. The knowledge that caring hands were working to provide comfort for those facing danger far from home. Sometimes Mr. Wilson would read aloud from books borrowed from the traveling library that visited Little Wickham once a fortnight. His voice, deep and measured, would fill the blackout-darkened cottage with stories of adventure and distant places, creating worlds of imagination that felt more vivid and immediate than any cinema screen. These simple evening rituals taught Lily that happiness didn't require abundance or excitement. It could be found in the warmth of a properly banked fire, the taste of carefully rationed chocolate shared as a special treat, the sound of familiar voices sharing the quiet satisfaction of another day successfully navigated together. The war had taken her away from everything she had known, but it had also given her something unexpected: the discovery that home wasn't necessarily a place, but rather a feeling of belonging that could emerge anywhere people chose to care for each other with patience and genuine affection. A garden of hope. The discovery would prove more profound than Lily could have imagined in those early October days, as autumn settled over Little Wickham with its characteristic English gentleness. The leaves on the ancient oak trees began their slow transformation from summer green to burnished gold, and the morning air carried that distinctive crispness that spoke of harvests and preparation for winter ahead. It was Mrs. Wilson who first invited Lily to help with what she called our little contribution to victory. The back garden of the Wilson cottage had been transformed from its peacetime flowerbeds into something far more practical. Rows of vegetables that stretched from the stone wall near the kitchen door all the way to the wooden fence that separated their property from the neighboring farm. Where once prize-winning roses had bloomed, now sturdy potato plants pushed their way through carefully mounded earth. The ornamental border that had once displayed delphiniums and hollyhocks now hosted neat lines of carrots, their feathery tops creating a different kind of beauty entirely. "Come along then, Lily," Mrs. Wilson called on that first morning, her voice carrying the particular warmth that had become so familiar. "The earth won't tend itself, and there's satisfaction to be found in honest work." She stood at the kitchen door, wearing a faded cotton dress protected by a canvas apron that had clearly seen many seasons of use. In her hands, she held 2 pairs of gardening gloves, one worn and shaped to her own fingers, the other smaller and newer, purchased specifically for this moment. The garden soil felt different beneath Lily's knees than anything she had experienced in London. Where the city had offered only hard pavements and the occasional patch of grass in the public squares, here the earth seemed alive, rich and dark, with that distinctive smell of growing things and organic matter slowly returning to the cycle of life. Mrs. Wilson showed her how to feel for the potatoes beneath their plants, how to brush away the soil gently with her fingers until the smooth, pale surface of a mature tuber revealed itself. "There's a trick to it," Mrs. Wilson explained, her hands demonstrating the careful technique. "You must be firm enough to find what you're looking for, but gentle enough not to damage what you find. Rather like dealing with people, I suppose, or understanding the complexities of this war we find ourselves fighting." The comparison wasn't lost on Lily. Even at her age, the war itself seemed to require this same delicate balance, the firmness to resist what was wrong, combined with the gentleness to preserve what was worth protecting. As she worked alongside Mrs. Wilson, carefully harvesting potatoes and placing them in the wicker basket between them, she began to understand something about the nature of resistance that went far beyond the dramatic stories of soldiers and battles that filled the wireless broadcasts each evening. The vegetables they pulled from the earth represented something more significant than simple sustenance. Each carrot, each turnip, each carefully tended cabbage was an act of defiance against the forces that sought to create scarcity and dependence. The German U-boats that prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes, attempting to starve Britain into submission, were being answered by millions of small gardens like this one. Ordinary people making the conscious choice to feed themselves and their communities through their own labor and determination. "Before the war," Mrs. Wilson shared as they moved to the row of Brussels sprouts, "I grew flowers because they were beautiful. Now I grow vegetables because they're necessary. But you know something curious, dear. I've discovered that necessity has its own kind of beauty, perhaps even more meaningful than the purely decorative." The Brussels sprouts stood like miniature cabbages along their thick stalks, each one a perfect small miracle of patient growth. Mrs. Wilson showed Lily how to twist them free from their stems, starting with the largest ones at the bottom and working upward, leaving the smaller ones to continue developing. The process required attention and care, qualities that Lily was learning to appreciate in ways that her previous city life had never demanded. Other villagers began appearing in their own gardens as the morning progressed, creating an informal community of shared labor that stretched across the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson from the house with the blue door was harvesting the last of her runner beans, their scarlet flowers still bright against the green pods. Mr. Thornbury, the retired postmaster, worked methodically through his onion patch, pulling the mature bulbs and laying them on wooden boards to dry in whatever sunshine the October days might provide. "Good morning, Eleanor," called Mrs. Henderson over the low hedge that separated their properties. "How are your leeks coming along?" "Mine seem determined to stay small this year, despite all my encouragement." "Patience, Margaret," Mrs. Wilson replied with a gentle laugh. "Leeks are like children. They grow in their own time, not ours. Though I suspect yours will be perfectly adequate for the harvest festival if we're fortunate enough to have one this year. The conversation continued in the easy rhythm of neighbors who had known each other for decades, their voices creating a backdrop of community connection that made the work feel less like labor and more like participation in something larger than individual survival. Lily listened as they discussed the challenges of maintaining their gardens without the chemical fertilizers that had become scarce, sharing techniques for composting kitchen scraps and managing without the young men who had traditionally helped with the heavier work before being called away to military service. Mr. Thornbury approached the fence between their gardens, carrying a small basket of his finest onions. "Eleanor, I wonder if you might be interested in a bit of trading. My onions have done exceptionally well this season, but I find myself rather short of potatoes. Perhaps we might work out some arrangement that benefits us both." This informal bartering system, Lily realized, represented another form of resistance against the disruptions that war had brought to normal commerce and supply chains. Rather than accepting scarcity as inevitable, the villagers were creating their own networks of exchange, ensuring that everyone had access to the variety of foods necessary for proper nutrition during these challenging times. Mrs. Wilson agreed readily to the trade, selecting a generous portion of their morning's potato harvest to exchange for Mr. Thornbury's onions. "Community cooperation," she explained to Lily as they made the exchange, "becomes more important during difficult times, not less. We succeed together or we struggle separately, and success together is infinitely preferable." The garden work continued through the morning, with Lily learning to distinguish between the vegetables that were ready for harvest and those that needed more time to reach maturity. The carrots required careful pulling to avoid breaking their roots, while the turnips came up more easily, their purple and white globes emerging from the soil like buried treasures waiting to be discovered. Mrs. Wilson pointed out the subtle signs that indicated readiness, the way carrot tops began to show hints of the orange root beneath the soil line, how cabbage heads felt firm and solid when gently squeezed, the particular size and color that indicated Brussels sprouts had reached their peak flavor. These skills, passed down through generations of English gardeners, were now serving a purpose that went beyond simple hobby or supplemental food production. "My grandmother taught me these things," Mrs. Wilson shared as they worked together, "during the last war, when gardens like this one helped keep families fed while the men were away fighting. I never imagined I would need to use this knowledge again, or that I would be teaching it to a young person under similar circumstances. But perhaps that's how important knowledge survives, passed from one generation to the next when circumstances make it necessary." The sun climbed higher as their morning's work progressed, warming the October air and bringing out the complex sense of earth and growing things that made the garden feel like a living entity rather than simply a collection of plants. Bees moved among the late-flowering herbs, their steady humming providing a peaceful counterpoint to the human voices and the gentle sounds of cultivation. By the time they finished their harvesting, the wicker baskets held a remarkable variety of fresh vegetables, enough to contribute significantly to their meals for the coming week, with extra to share with neighbors or preserve for the winter months ahead. The abundance felt almost miraculous, considering that it had emerged from what had been ordinary soil through nothing more than careful planning, consistent attention, and the patient application of traditional knowledge to current necessity. "There," Mrs. Wilson said with satisfaction, surveying their morning's work. "Food security, one potato at a time. Hitler's submarines may control the shipping lanes, but they cannot control the English soil or the determination of English gardeners. This garden represents hope made tangible, the confidence that we will still be here to harvest what we plant, and that our community will endure whatever challenges may come." As they carried their harvest toward the kitchen, Lily understood that she had participated in something far more significant than simple food production. The garden represented resilience, community cooperation, and the quiet confidence that ordinary people could meet extraordinary challenges through practical action and mutual support. The war might rage across Europe and beyond, but here in Little Wickham, life continued to grow from the earth with patient determination. Act. Echoes in the night. The first air raid siren came on a Tuesday evening in October, its mournful wail cutting through the peaceful sounds of supper preparation. Lily was helping Mrs. Wilson shell peas when the undulating cry began, rising and falling like some mechanical banshee across the village rooftops. The older woman's hands stilled for just a moment before she calmly set down her bowl. "Right then," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency building in the distance. "Time to practice what we've prepared for." The Anderson shelter had been installed in the Wilsons' back garden 3 weeks earlier, a corrugated iron structure half buried in the earth, camouflaged with sod and bordered by late-blooming chrysanthemums. What had seemed like an adventure during its construction now felt soberly practical as they gathered their emergency supplies. Mrs. Wilson moved with practiced efficiency, collecting the hurricane lamp, the thermos of tea, and the small suitcase packed with essentials. "Remember what we discussed," she told Lily as they made their way down the garden path. "The shelter is our safe harbor. We wait there until the all-clear sounds, no matter how long it takes." Inside the shelter, the air smelled of damp earth and metal. Wooden benches lined the walls, cushioned with old blankets and pillows. Mrs. Wilson lit the hurricane lamp, casting dancing shadows on the curved walls. Through the ventilation slits, they could hear other families making similar preparations. The creak of garden gates, the soft murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet on gravel paths. "Will the bombs come here?" Lily asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Mrs. Wilson considered the question seriously. "They might, dear one. The railway junction makes us a possible target. But our shelter is strong, and we're together. That's what matters most." The waiting was the hardest part. Outside, the village had fallen into an unnatural quiet, broken only by the distant drone of aircraft engines. Lily pressed her ear to the wall, trying to distinguish between the familiar sound of RAF Hurricanes and the deeper, more ominous rumble of German bombers. Mrs. Wilson had taught her the difference during their aircraft recognition sessions, knowledge that now felt urgently relevant rather than merely educational. The first explosions came from the direction of the railway yards, perhaps 2 miles away. The sound traveled through the earth itself, a deep, resonant thump that seemed to vibrate through the shelter's metal walls. Lily instinctively moved closer to Mrs. Wilson, who wrapped a steady arm around her shoulders. "The bombers are targeting the rail lines," Mrs. Wilson explained quietly. "They want to disrupt supply movements to the coast. It's strategic thinking. Unpleasant, but logical." More explosions followed, some closer, some farther away. Between the bombing runs, they could hear the sharp crack of anti-aircraft guns from the defense positions established around the junction. The gunners were local men, farmers and shopkeepers who had trained with the Home Guard, now manning their posts through the long, dangerous night. "Mr. Patterson from the post office is on one of those gun crews," Mrs. Wilson mentioned, her voice carrying a note of quiet pride. "Yesterday he was sorting mail and selling stamps. Tonight he's defending our village. Ordinary people rising to extraordinary circumstances." The psychological weight of the bombing was unlike anything Lily had experienced. The Blitz in London had been distant thunder during her final weeks there, but this felt immediate and personal. These bombs were falling on places she knew, near the school where she studied, close to the shops where she helped with errands, threatening the gardens where she had learned to coax life from the soil. Yet somehow the fear felt manageable within the shelter's protective embrace. Mrs. Wilson's calm presence, the familiar smell of her lavender sachets, the steady glow of the hurricane lamp. These elements created a pocket of safety amid the chaos above. The shelter became a small world unto itself, where normal conversation could continue despite the extraordinary circumstances outside. "During the Great War," Mrs. Wilson said softly, "we didn't have shelters like this. We made do with cellars and basements, hoping for the best. The Zeppelin raids were terrifying because we felt so helpless. But this time, we're better prepared. We've learned from experience." Through the ventilation slits, they began to hear voices from neighboring shelters. The Hendersons were singing softly, hymns and folk songs that carried across the garden fences. Someone was playing a harmonica, the melody weaving between the more distant sounds of aircraft and artillery. Children's voices joined in, creating an impromptu community choir that transformed the night from one of isolated fear into shared resilience. "Listen to that," Mrs. Wilson whispered. "Hitler's bombs cannot silence our songs." As the hours passed, a routine emerged. Between bombing runs, neighbors would call out to check on each other. "All well at the Hendersons? Wilson family safe? Anyone need medical attention?" These brief exchanges created invisible threads of connection across the darkened village, weaving a network of mutual care that strengthened with each passing raid. Mrs. Wilson produced a thermos of soup from their emergency supplies, along with thick slices of bread wrapped in clean tea towels. The simple meal, consumed by lamplight in their underground refuge, somehow tasted better than many peacetime suppers. Perhaps it was the heightened awareness that came with danger, or perhaps it was the profound gratitude for safety and companionship in uncertain times. Food tastes different when you're truly grateful for it, Mrs. Wilson observed, echoing Lily's thoughts. Rationing has taught us not to take meals for granted. Tonight teaches us not to take safety for granted either. The bombing continued intermittently through the night, but the pattern became familiar. The drone of approaching aircraft, the whistle of falling bombs, the earth-shaking explosions, then the relative quiet before the next wave arrived. During the quiet periods, stories emerged from the neighboring shelters. Tales of close calls, acts of heroism, moments of unexpected humor amid the terror. Mr. Henderson's voice carried clearly through the still air as he recounted how his prize rooster had refused to take shelter, instead perching defiantly on the chicken coop throughout the entire raid. Bravest bird in Hertfordshire, he declared with evident pride, or the most foolish. Sometimes there's little difference between courage and stubbornness. The children adapted with remarkable resilience. After the initial fear subsided, they began treating the shelter time as an adventure, telling ghost stories, playing word games, sharing treats from their emergency rations. Their laughter, muffled but persistent, provided a counterpoint to the more serious adult conversations about damage assessments and casualty reports filtering in from other villages. Children possess a natural wisdom about adapting to circumstances, Mrs. Wilson reflected. They accept what cannot be changed and find joy in what remains possible. Perhaps that's why they recover from trauma more readily than adults. They haven't yet learned to fight against reality. Near dawn, the all-clear siren finally sounded, a steady, unwavering note that seemed to release the collective breath the entire village had been holding. Emerging from their shelters, neighbors gathered in the grey morning light to assess the damage and check on each other's welfare. Miraculously, Little Wickham itself had been spared direct hits. Those smoke columns rose from the direction of the railway junction. The sight that greeted them was both sobering and inspiring. Gardens were littered with shrapnel fragments and broken glass, but the houses stood intact. More importantly, every family emerged safely from their shelters. The community's preparation and mutual support had seen them through their first major test. Mrs. Patterson arrived with news from the village centre. The post office lost its windows and there's a crater in the churchyard, she reported, but the railway's still operational and no one was seriously hurt. The Home Guard performed admirably, kept the guns firing all night. As they walked back toward the house, Lily noticed how the shared experience had subtly changed the village's social dynamics. Neighbors who had previously exchanged only polite greetings now spoke with the familiarity of people who had weathered danger together. Children who had been strangers before the raid were already making plans to meet in the shelters if another attack came. Crisis reveals character, Mrs. Wilson observed, surveying the scene of quiet recovery beginning around them. But it also creates character. We're not quite the same people who entered those shelters last night. We've proven to ourselves that we can endure whatever comes. The morning brought practical tasks, sweeping up glass, checking for structural damage, tending to frightened livestock. But underneath these routine activities ran a current of quiet confidence. They had faced the bombers and survived not through luck alone, but through preparation, community cooperation, and mutual care. Standing in their garden, looking at the Anderson shelter that had sheltered them through the long night, Lily felt a complex mixture of emotions. Fear remained. There would certainly be more raids, but alongside the fear was something stronger, a growing understanding that ordinary people, working together with practical wisdom and shared determination, could meet extraordinary challenges and emerge not just intact, but somehow strengthened by the experience. Letters and longing. That understanding would prove invaluable in the weeks that followed, as Little Wickham settled into the rhythm of a nation at war. The immediate shock of the air raid gave way to a more persistent challenge, one that touched Lily's heart more deeply than the distant rumble of aircraft engines. The letters came irregularly, carried by the village postman on his ancient bicycle, his leather satchel bulging with correspondence that connected scattered families across a kingdom under siege. When Mrs. Wilson called, "Lily dear, there's post for you," the girl's heart would leap with a mixture of joy and apprehension that had become as familiar as her morning porridge. Her mother's handwriting, careful and deliberate on the thin wartime paper, carried news from a London that seemed increasingly distant from the pastoral rhythms of Little Wickham. "My darling girl," the letters always began, "I hope this finds you well and happy in the countryside." But between the lines of cheerful updates about neighbours and reassurances about her father's health, Lily had learned to read the subtle signs of strain. "The city is quite different now," her mother wrote in early November. "Your father and I have moved our mattress down to the underground station most nights. It's become quite social, actually. Mrs. Henderson from downstairs brings her knitting, and Mr. Foster has organised a chess tournament. We've made friends with families we'd never spoken to before the war." Mrs. Wilson, reading over Lily's shoulder with the gentle concern that had become second nature, would nod thoughtfully. "Your mother sounds very brave, dear, and practical too. That's the London spirit, that is." But Lily could sense what the letters didn't say, the careful omission of details about the bombing. The way her mother's usually flowing script sometimes seemed hurried, as if written between urgent interruptions. The gradual disappearance of familiar neighbourhood references. Shops that were no longer mentioned, friends whose names stopped appearing in the weekly updates. In December, the tone of the letters shifted subtly. "I've taken a position at the Woolwich Arsenal," her mother wrote. "It's important work, and the other women are wonderful company. We work long shifts, but there's such a sense of purpose in what we're doing. Every shell casing we produce, every component we assemble, it's our contribution to bringing you home safely." Mrs. Wilson explained what this meant. "Your mother's become a munitions worker, Lily. Dangerous work, that, but vital. The women in the factories, they're as much a part of this war effort as any soldier." Lily tried to picture her mother, who had always been so careful with her appearance, working in overalls among the massive machinery of war production. The image both filled her with pride and deepened her longing to see her parents again. The letters from her father were different. Shorter, more practical, but no less loving. He wrote about his work with the Air Raid Precautions Service, about organising shelter rotations and helping neighbours whose homes had been damaged. "I think of you every morning when I walk past the ruins of the old bakery on Elm Street," he wrote. "I remember how you loved their currant buns. When this is all over, we'll find an even better bakery and you can have all the currant buns you want." Meanwhile, in London, Margaret Hartwell finished her shift at the Woolwich Arsenal as the pale December dawn filtered through the factory's reinforced windows. Her hands, stained with the metallic residue of her work, ached from 12 hours of precise, repetitive assembly. Around her, dozens of other women were completing the same ritual, removing their protective clothing, washing their faces at the long row of sinks, preparing for the journey home through streets that might look entirely different than they had the morning before. The work was exhausting, but Margaret had discovered something unexpected in the camaraderie of the factory floor. These women, drawn from every corner of London society, had formed bonds that transcended the class distinctions that had once seemed so important. Lady Pemberton, whose husband served in the Admiralty, worked alongside Mary Sullivan, whose 3 sons were somewhere in North Africa with the 8th Army. They shared tea from the same thermos, complained about the same supervisors, and worried together about the same nightly raids. "Any word from your little one?" asked Betty Morrison, a widow from Bermondsey, whose own children had been evacuated to Wales. Margaret smiled, pulling Lily's latest letter from her coat pocket. The child's handwriting had improved remarkably since September, and her descriptions of village life painted pictures that seemed almost impossibly peaceful. "She's learned to milk a cow," Margaret shared, "and apparently she's become quite the expert on vegetable gardening." "That's the thing about children," Betty observed, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had raised 4 of her own. "They adapt faster than we do. Sometimes I think they're teaching us how to be brave." The journey home took Margaret through neighbourhoods that bore the increasingly visible scars of the Blitz. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, their absence creating strange new vistas across the London skyline. But what struck her most was not the destruction, but the persistence of normal life around it. Shopkeepers swept debris from their storefronts and opened for business. Children played elaborate games among the ruins. Women queued patiently for rationed goods, their conversations mixing complaints about shortages with updates on family members serving overseas. At the corner of her own street, Margaret paused at the communal notice board that had become the neighborhood's nerve center. Messages from evacuated children were pinned alongside official announcements and requests for assistance. Johnny Brewster, age 7, safe and well in Somerset, sends love to Mum and Dad. Mrs. Whitfield seeks news of her sister in Portsmouth. Victory Garden surplus potatoes available for trade. These small communications, Margaret realized, were the threads that held their community together. Each message represented someone refusing to let distance or danger sever the connections that made them more than just individuals surviving a crisis. In her own small flat, Margaret sat at the kitchen table where the family had shared thousands of meals and began her weekly letter to Lily. The ritual had become as important to her as any religious observance. She chose her words carefully, wanting to maintain the connection without burdening her daughter with adult fears. "My dearest Lily," she wrote, "your father and I are so proud of how you're growing and learning in Little Wickham. Mrs. Wilson writes that you've become quite helpful with the younger evacuee children and that you've mastered the art of making a proper cup of tea. These may seem like small accomplishments, but they represent something much larger: your ability to find your place in a new community and contribute to its well-being." She paused, listening to the familiar sounds of evening in wartime London. The distant rumble of traffic, more muted now due to fuel rationing. The voices of neighbors calling to each other across the narrow street. The mechanical hum of aircraft engines. Always present now, requiring a moment of attention to determine whether they carried threat or reassurance. "I want you to know," she continued writing, "that every day I work in the factory, I think about the future we're building for you. Not just the military equipment we're producing, but the world we're creating through our choices about how to treat each other during difficult times. You're learning the same lessons in Little Wickham, that ordinary people, working together with kindness and determination, can create something stronger than any individual effort." Margaret sealed the letter with the small ritual that had become precious to her. A brief moment of holding the envelope and imagining it in Lily's hands, bridging the miles between them with words of love and encouragement. Outside her window, London prepared for another night of uncertainty. But inside the small flat, surrounded by photographs and memories of peacetime family life, Margaret Hartwell felt the same complex mixture of emotions that her daughter experienced in the countryside. Fear for what tomorrow might bring, but also hope, grounded in the daily evidence that people could choose compassion over despair, cooperation over isolation, and love over the forces that sought to divide them. The war had scattered their family across the English landscape, but it had also revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed. In learning to live apart, they were discovering new ways to remain connected, not just to each other, but to the larger human story of resilience and mutual care that was being written in countless small acts of courage across their embattled island. Victory and homecoming. The morning of May 8, 1945, dawned with an unusual stillness across Little Wickham, as if the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to unfold. Lily, now nearly 14 and taller by several inches than when she'd first arrived with her cardboard suitcase, was helping Mrs. Wilson hang washing on the line when they heard it. The distant sound of church bells ringing from the village centre, not the measured tolling of Sunday service, but something wild and joyful and unrestrained. Mrs. Wilson dropped the wet sheet she was holding, her weathered hands flying to her mouth as understanding dawned in her eyes. "Could it be?" she whispered, and then louder, with growing certainty, "Could it really be?" The bells were joined by others now, from neighboring villages, a cascade of bronze voices carrying across the countryside, the news that everyone had been hoping for, praying for, through 6 long years of separation and sacrifice and stubborn endurance. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Victory had come at last. Within minutes, the village green was filling with people emerging from cottages and shops, their faces bright with disbelief and joy, neighbors embracing neighbors with tears streaming down their cheeks. Mrs. Henderson from the post office was actually dancing right there on the cobblestones with old Mr. Jameson from the hardware store, both of them laughing like children. The blackout curtains that had shrouded windows for so many years were being torn down and flung into the street. Dark fabric trampled underfoot as symbols of a darkness that was finally lifting. Lily found herself swept up in the celebration, her heart pounding with a mixture of elation and something else, something more complex and bittersweet. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the end they had all been working toward through the long nights in the Anderson shelter, through the careful rationing of sugar and butter, through the patient tending of victory gardens and the anxious reading of letters from London. But now that it had arrived, she realized it meant something she hadn't quite prepared herself for. It meant going home. The thought of returning to London filled her with excitement, certainly. The prospect of sleeping in her own small bedroom again, of walking familiar streets, of being held in her mother's arms without the constraint of brief, precious visits. But it also brought an unexpected ache, a recognition that Little Wickham had become more than just a temporary refuge. These rolling hills and narrow lanes, the rhythm of village life, the deep satisfaction of watching vegetables grow from seed to harvest. All of this had woven itself into the fabric of who she was becoming. Mrs. Wilson seemed to understand without words being spoken. That evening, as the celebration continued around a bonfire on the village green, she sat with Lily on the garden wall where they had spent so many quiet moments together, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. "You'll be wanting to get back to your parents," she said gently, and there was no sadness in her voice, only love and understanding. "Yes," Lily replied, surprised by the thickness in her throat. "But I'll miss this. I'll miss you." She gestured toward the cottage behind them, with its low-beamed kitchen and the bedroom under the eaves that had sheltered her through air raids and quiet nights alike. "I never expected to feel this way about leaving." Mrs. Wilson nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's how you know you've truly lived somewhere," she said. "When leaving requires a piece of your heart to stay behind. But hearts are miraculous things, my dear. They can be in more than one place at once. Part of you will always be here, just as part of this place will always travel with you." The preparations for departure took several weeks, not because there was much to pack, but because there were so many goodbyes to be said, so many final moments to be savored. Lily walked through the village as if seeing it for the first time, memorizing the way morning light fell across the church tower, the sound of Mrs. Patterson's chickens clucking in their yard, the particular green of the fields where she had helped with harvest time after harvest time. She visited the Victory Garden one last time, now flourishing under the late spring sun with rows of lettuce and early peas, the raspberry canes heavy with developing fruit. The garden that had taught her so much about patience and hope, about the way small daily acts could accumulate into something sustaining and beautiful. She knelt and pressed her palm against the dark earth, feeling its warmth and richness, trying to imprint the sensation in her memory. The train journey back to London felt both endless and far too brief. The countryside rolling past the windows like pages of a beloved book being turned for the final time. But as the familiar outlines of the city appeared on the horizon, Lily felt her heart begin to race with anticipation. The London she was returning to would be different from the one she had left, scarred by bombing, marked by years of struggle, but also somehow more precious for having survived. King's Cross Station was chaos. Joyful, overwhelming chaos as families reunited after years of separation. Lily stepped off the train with her suitcase in one hand and a small potted cutting from Mrs. Wilson's herb garden in the other, scanning the crowd for faces that lived so vividly in her memory, but which she hadn't seen in person for many months. And then she saw them, her mother and father, older than she remembered, her father's hair now touched with grey, her mother thinner, but with eyes bright with unshed tears. For a moment they all stood frozen, as if afraid that moving might break the spell, might reveal this reunion to be just another dream. Then her mother was running toward her, arms outstretched, and Lily was running too, the years of separation collapsing into nothing as she was enfolded in the embrace she had carried in her heart through every homesick night. "My darling girl," her mother whispered against her hair. "My brave, wonderful girl. You've grown so tall, so beautiful." Her father's arms came around them both, and Lily breathed in the scent of his familiar cologne mixed with her mother's lavender soap, anchoring herself in the reality of their presence. The flat in Bloomsbury had indeed changed. Windows that had been blown out during the Blitz were now repaired but bore the subtle scars of replacement glass, and the building next door was simply gone, leaving an empty lot where wildflowers had begun to grow among the rubble. But inside, her parents had tried to keep everything exactly as she had left it. Her books still arranged on their shelf, her small collection of treasures still displayed on the windowsill. That first night back, as she lay in her own bed for the first time in nearly 6 years, Lily found herself strangely wakeful. The sounds of the city, traffic and voices, and the distant rumble of trains seemed almost foreign after so long in the countryside. She rose and went to the window, looking out over the London skyline, seeing the gaps where buildings had once stood, but also seeing the lights. Blessed lights shining freely from uncurtained windows, proclaiming to the world that the darkness was over. In the weeks that followed, as she readjusted to city life and prepared to continue her education, Lily often found herself thinking about the girl who had arrived at Little Wickham Station with tears on her cheeks and terror in her heart. That frightened 8-year-old seemed like someone from another lifetime, not because the memories had faded, but because the experiences of those years had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had learned that home was not just a place, but a feeling, a sense of belonging that could be created anywhere through love and care and shared purpose. She had discovered that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage, that communities could be forged in the most unlikely circumstances, and that even in the darkest times, there was always the possibility of growth, of hope, of small daily acts of resistance against despair. The herb cutting from Mrs. Wilson's garden, now planted in a pot on the windowsill, began to put out new leaves. A living bridge between the life she had lived in the countryside and the life she was building anew in London. Sometimes she would touch its leaves and remember the feeling of earth between her fingers, the satisfaction of watching seeds transform into sustenance, the quiet wisdom of a village that had taught her so much about resilience and grace. Her parents, too, had been changed by the war. Her mother's hands bore the calluses of factory work. Her father's eyes held shadows from whatever he had witnessed during his service. But they had all survived, and more than survived. They had discovered strengths they hadn't known they possessed, had learned that love could stretch across any distance, could endure any separation, could emerge from the crucible of difficulty, not weakened but somehow purified and made more precious. Years later, when Lily had children of her own, she would tell them stories of the village that had sheltered her, of the woman who had shown her how to tend a garden and weather a storm, of the way a community could gather around its most vulnerable members and create safety through simple acts of care. She would teach them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act with kindness despite it, that home was something you carried within yourself, but also something you created for others. And on quiet evenings, when the light was fading and the day's work was done, she would sometimes find herself thinking of Little Wickham, wondering if the cottage still stood with its garden blooming behind the low stone wall, if children still played on the village green where she had once danced around a victory bonfire, if the church bells still rang out across the countryside, carrying news of joy and sorrow, marking the passage of time and the endurance of community. The war had ended, but the lessons it had taught lived on, woven into the fabric of who she had become, carried forward into a future that seemed suddenly bright with possibility. She had been an evacuee, a child displaced by forces beyond her control, but she had also been something more. A witness to the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people, a participant in the great human story of survival and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let darkness have the final word. And in the gathering twilight of memory, as the years folded one into another, like pages of a well-loved book, she could still feel it all. The warmth of Mrs. Wilson's kitchen on winter evenings, the satisfaction of vegetables grown from her own hands, the sound of church bells carrying across the countryside, the news that light had triumphed over darkness, that separated families would be reunited, that the long exile was over and the journey home could finally, joyfully begin.